Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the launch of Kevin Pham's first book, The Architects of Dignity, Vietnamese Visions of Decolonization, which is published by Oxford University Press. And I'm pleased to see that you have come in such large numbers. Special welcome to Dr. Yen Wu from the Fulbright University. I will introduce you later on. It's an honor, a real honor for me to open this book presentation. My name is Remco van der Maar. I'm a senior lecturer at the Department of History at the University of Amsterdam. I completed my PhD thesis on the Netherlands and the Vietnam War in 2007, a long time ago. Since then, I've done research on many different topics. But I guess the war in Vietnam is one of those topics that stay with you forever. In the spring of 2025, I will publish a new book on North and South Vietnamese propaganda strategies in the West during the war, intended for a broader Dutch audience, which I feel is very important. The University of Amsterdam is grateful and proud that Kevin will present his book here tonight. Just a year ago, Kevin, we met for the first time. And I'm very glad that we did. A bit late, maybe. As many of you know, Kevin is not only a very likable person, but he immediately struck me as an open-minded, always curious, sincere, and inspiring academic. And I believe these qualities are reflected in this book. Like many Western scholars, I have mostly studied the political and military history of the war from Western perspective, or a communist Vietnamese perspective. But in a new and very original way, Kevin's book confronts us historians with the limitation of these approaches. He shows the importance of digging deep in Vietnamese intellectual history, investigating the different roots of anti-colonial resistance against injustice, exploitation and racism, and the decolonization that followed. This part of Vietnamese history turned out to be very diverse and rich, and yet overlooked by most Western historians, I have to say. Nearly 60 years ago, at the square that is in front of us right now, there were violent protests against the American intervention in Vietnam. These protests then developed into a broad transnational solidarity movement with Vietnamese struggle against the United States. The knowledge of the Vietnamese history at the time and afterwards, however, left much to be desired. And in Dutch popular culture, the Vietnam War has become and still is portrayed as an American failure and defeat, or as an American tragedy. So I believe Kevin's book is not just relevant for us professionals, but it is also of interest for a broader general public. Let's turn to Kevin now. He will be interviewed about his book by Dr. Yen Wu. Yen is a faculty member at Fulbright University Vietnam, Vietnam's first liberal arts university. She specializes in Vietnamese Francophone literature and intellectual history, and has done extensive research on the question of how Vietnamese intellectuals have worked with and through language to establish their ideas of freedom in colonial and post-colonial Vietnam. Together with Kevin, she also co-hosts a podcast for Vietnam studies and the Vietnamese American community. Please, Kevin and Yen, I invite you to enter the stage, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's my first time in Amsterdam. I flew from very, very far away, from Ho Chi Minh City, or some might know as Saigon, where I teach literature at Fulbright University Vietnam. And as Remco said, it's the first liberal arts initiative in the country. And it's extremely special for me to be part of this institution, which is a joint project between the US government and Vietnam, because like Kevin, I am Vietnamese American, and my father was a South Vietnamese veteran, and my family moved to the US in the 1990s. So this fraught history between Vietnam and America is what makes this initiative particularly exciting for me to be a part of. The fact that Fulbright exists, the publication of Kevin's book, the forthcoming study by Rimco, as well as my own research, this is all pointing to a special moment for Vietnam. What is that moment? It's a moment where we're beginning to move away from just studying the war to look at Vietnam critically, not just as a place that's culturally rich, but also with really good ideas. So while Kevin and I are interested in Vietnam, we examine it through different lenses. Kevin is a political theorist. He's interested in questions of political life, and I am a literary scholar, so I'm interested in thinking about how language and expression reflects and shapes the life around us. I did my PhD training in French studies, and what intrigued me about the French language and French culture was something that I was actually already exposed to as a child. My native Vietnamese was sprinkled with a vocabulary that carried vestiges of France's presence in Vietnam. And as I studied French, it actually just brought me back closer to Vietnam. I ended up writing my dissertation on Vietnamese writers who choose to write in French, much like how Kafka, who was born Czech and Jewish, would choose to write in German. I'm interested in what happens when writers choose to write in a language that's not their native tongue, and how doing so allows them to pause, to think about the world around them and society in alternative ways, and to feel a certain freedom in doing so. In other words, I think about how writing in French is a choice in form, much like how an artist might choose photography as their medium of expression. What does photography afford the artist that perhaps paint might not? And in this case, what does the French language offer the Vietnamese in ways that are different from their native Vietnamese? So where Kevin's work and my work intersect is in our interest in this colonial period. It's a period of oppression, yes, but also a period of a high confluence of ideas. Thinkers like Nguyễn An Ninh and Nguyễn Mạnh Tường figure in both of our works because they belong to this age of enlightenment in Vietnam, where the point is not just to engage with new technology or science. It's a whole new attitude toward knowledge. How we ask questions, how we approach and view our object of inquiry. And that object of inquiry is, of course, Vietnam. These thinkers in the 20th century learned French and engaged with French thought, which then allowed them to see their home country in a new light. They had their own perspective, raised in Vietnam, but now we're also equipped with a second perspective, that of the colonizer, no less. And it's extremely advantageous to have access to multiple perspectives, even sometimes contradictory or conflicting ones. And although not all of these intellectuals went abroad, they still surrounded themselves with one another. They created spaces for intellectual engagement, and they published with each other. And I would say that this new attitude is not unlike the attitude that Kevin and I approach with Vietnam. Kevin and I are part of this very unique cohort of scholars where, despite being second-generation Vietnamese Americans, I would say that we're the first to examine the history of our parents in a very critical manner. And we do this in the English language scholarship. Our experiences of Vietnam from within, but also without, have imbued us with a very special lens to look at Vietnam, much like the intellectuals we engage with. Vietnam, therefore, is not just some faraway place that we leave behind, or a repertoire of painful memories that we've inherited from our parents. For us, with the privilege of being second-generation Vietnamese, Vietnam is also a place we return to, not just for personal interest, but also for epistemological inquiry. So now I would like to invite Kevin, my dear friend, to talk more about his book, Architects of Dignity, Vietnamese Visions of Decolonization, published with Oxford University Press last month.
Good evening. Thank you, Remco and Yen, for those generous opening remarks. Remco, I look forward to reading your exciting book in Dutch. Ik ben zo blij dat je hier bent. Dank je wel. Yen, you've been there from the beginning of this journey of my book, a journey that you've made more meaningful and joyful than it would have been without you. Thank you for coming all the way from Vietnam. Thank you, SPUI25, for making this happen. And thank you to a different Kevin. There he is back there. The owner of Bonjour Café, my favorite Vietnamese restaurant in Amsterdam, for bringing us delicious iced tea and snacks this evening. Thank you to those who sponsored the food, my program group at the University of Amsterdam called Challenges to Democratic Representation. And of course, I thank all of you for coming here tonight. I'll tell you how I came to write this book, what it's about, and why it matters. In an academic presentation, I would start immediately by telling you the core argument of the book, but this will be a bit different. I'll get to the argument later. Let me first ask a few big questions. That's us and my book. What is a good life? Is it one where we pursue our private goals and let others pursue theirs? Or is it one where we devote ourselves first to our community? Is society a contract between self-interested individuals or a big family where we each have roles and duties towards each other? What values should we prioritize? Justice, harmony, freedom, or something else? What do those words mean? And who should rule? One person, like in a monarchy, or every citizen? Democracy. These are the big questions of political theory. If you try to answer them, you're doing political theory. When I was a university student in California, I was fascinated by these questions because they seemed universal. It seemed that anyone, anywhere, anytime could ask and try to answer these questions. But when I studied these questions in my courses on political theory, we mostly studied how thinkers from the West have answered them. And I put air quotes around the West because the world's much more complicated than that. But you know what I mean, Western, European, North American. My syllabi and bookshelves were lined with books by Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Rousseau, Marx, Rawls, white men. But if these big questions really are universal, why didn't my books and courses show how people outside the West have answered them? For a long time, political theorists have assumed that political theory mainly happens in treatises, written books with systematic, logical arguments. But they're beginning to realize that political theory also happens in speeches, pamphlets, letters, newspapers, wherever humans express themselves to try to make sense of their world so that they can respond to it with their own actions. With this broader understanding of where we can find political theory, we're now seeing scholarly work emerge about the political thought from people previously excluded from the field of political theory. And it turns out that political thinkers outside the West can challenge and enhance Western conventional wisdom about political life. There's at least one big difference between Western and non-Western political theory, and that is the experience of European colonialism. Colonialism is when a group of people settles in a foreign land and dominates the indigenous people in that land. This has been happening everywhere for a very long time. But for the last 500 years, Europeans have conquered or colonized most of the planet at a speed and scale never seen before. European colonialism has shaped our modern world. Therefore, much of modern political thought in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America has been shaped by their experiences under European colonialism or domination. Therefore, their big questions might look a little different. Before they ask, what's a good life? What values should we have? They might ask, how did Europeans dominate us? Is European colonialism a law of nature, the strong dominating the weak, as social Darwinists might say? Or is colonialism a result of capitalism, as Vladimir Lenin would say? And how do we respond? What should we do with our traditional values given the influx of new ideas from Europe? You can see this reflected in changing clothing, fashion. And here's a cathedral in Saigon. And when colonizers racially abuse us, humiliate us, or dehumanize us, how should we react? Here's a picture of the wife and daughter of Paul Doumer, the French Governor General, one of the French Governor Generals of Indochina. They're tossing coins to Vietnamese children as if they're feeding pigeons. When I showed this picture online, I saw some comments of Vietnamese people saying, "My blood is boiling." Well, one question is, what do you do with that boiling blood? If you react with violence, if it's isolated, you might suffer terrible reprisals. So if you want to respond with violence, what do you do? How do you make it organized? How do you get people on your side? How do we channel our indignation into productive political projects? How do we generate power and unity amongst ourselves to resist colonialism or to do revolution? And what exactly should resistance and revolution look like? What should be the methods and goals? In short, what's the best vision of decolonization? My book, The Architects of Dignity, Vietnamese Visions of Decolonization, shows how Vietnamese thinkers answered these questions during French colonialism, which lasted from 1858 to 1954, almost 100 years. It's the first book in political theory to engage with Vietnamese thinkers. And I wrote it as if to my younger self when I was 18 and I wanted to know, what did Vietnamese thinkers think? My parents were refugees from Vietnam fleeing the aftermath of a Vietnamese civil war. This civil war came to involve the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, others. Americans call it the Vietnam War. Vietnamese communists called it, officially, the resistance war against America to save the country. And some Vietnamese anti-communists called it the war against northern communist aggression. Growing up in the United States, I watched movies and documentaries about the war. And I have to be honest, it was important to see those images, but sometimes I was tired or frustrated at how the Vietnamese people were portrayed. They were always either victims of the Americans or of the communists or of the ocean, the refugee experience, or they were villains who were dictators from the North or the South, or they were puppets of big powers, the United States or the Soviet Union. In all of these portrayals, the Vietnamese were never thinkers with complex motivations, with complex answers to big political, philosophical questions. In my last year of university, I asked myself, were there Vietnamese thinkers, political theorists, that we in the West can learn from? After I graduated, I moved to Vietnam to learn about the country my parents fled and to relearn the language. For 8 months, I lived in Nha Trang in central Vietnam. And for work, I taught English. And on my time off, I traveled around the country. And one thing stood out to me, the street signs. Major streets and schools were named after Vietnamese national heroes. And of course, you have Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum in Hanoi. This pantheon of Vietnamese figures whose names embellish the country stretched across history from those fighting Chinese domination, which the national narrative goes lasted from 111 BC to 938 AD, almost 1,000 years, to those fighting French colonial rule. And this planted the seed for my book. Who were these people on the street signs in schools, and what were their thoughts? I was especially interested in the French colonial period because what happens when East meets West? I wanted to know who were the most important, influential political thinkers during that time, the first half of the 20th century. So I asked everybody, shopkeepers, street vendors selling banh mi, pho, students, businessmen, businesswomen, people working at museums, educated intellectuals, who were the most influential Vietnamese thinkers? I read books on Vietnamese history, and eventually I came up with the list of 6 figures. Each had a different vision of what decolonization should look like, a different political theory for building a new Vietnam in the face of French colonialism. Here they are, and that's the table of contents of my book. They each get a chapter. You might notice they're all men. I wish that was not the case, but Vietnam in the first half of the 20th century was a patriarchal society, so the most influential political figures were men. Women certainly played a significant role in decolonization. Half of the Viet Minh who fought and defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 were women, and some were military leaders even, Nguyen Thi Dinh, for example. But unfortunately, because of patriarchy, there were very few thought leaders who were women. Those are the key figures in my book, and between them raged a battle of ideas. Who were they? What did they say? And how do they educate us? For this discussion, Yen will join me.
So we wanted to do a format that would be a little bit more interesting than just talking at the audience. And if you listen to our podcast, it's a lot of this. It's a lot of Kevin Yen banter. Okay, so Kevin, before we turn to the thinkers which you have here, can you tell us a little bit more about the title, The Architects of Dignity?
It's a great question, Yen. Thank you. It's the core argument of my book. These were architects of dignity, and it sheds a new light, a different perspective on a word that we're all familiar with, dignity. In the West, think of dignity as something inherent in individuals, as something that justifies rights, and as something that requires social recognition. But these thinkers eventually realize they don't want to depend on recognition by their colonizers. For them, it's quite meaningless to say dignity is something inherent that justifies rights. It won't mean much when the French continue to oppress you and no stronger power is going to come rescue you. For them, dignity becomes a duty, something to assert, something for the nation, not just for the individual. So it's national dignity that is something to be designed and constructed. One must be an architect of dignity.
And so I want to turn to this concept of dignity later when we talk about shame. But for now, let's engage with this visual here that you have for the table of contents. The first part. So there's 3 parts, but the first part, can you tell us about that first part to start?
So the first part's titled The Colonial Condition, and this looks at the earliest reactions in Vietnam to French colonialism through the lenses of 2 of the most important nationalists, the first nationalists, really, in Vietnam, Phan Boi Cho and Phan Chu Trinh. It was really easy to come up with those names. I would hear them all the time growing up in my family. They're simply the most important Vietnamese nationalists in the early 20th century. And they were the first to be exposed to ideas from the West. They were friends, but they had very different ideas. Through the lens of Phan Boi Cho, we can see the early reactions. And for the first time, here is someone in Vietnam trying to persuade the Vietnamese to see themselves not just as mere subjects of an emperor, but as citizens of a country. So he writes about how the French are violating their country. He describes it. Here's how big our country is. Here's what it looks like. And he does it to make his readers angry so that they could develop national consciousness. So you see in real time this nation being created. He also tried to make his readers feel hope by writing utopian descriptions of Vietnam. He says, someday Vietnam will have buildings thousands of meters high, to inspire them, to say, if you work hard enough, this is what we can achieve. He says he was ultimately a failure, but he provides a nationalist framework that the rest of the thinkers in the book will work from and develop in new directions. Phan Chu Trinh, on the other hand, was much more interested in ideas. He's Vietnam's first Democrat. He argued that the Vietnamese were conquered because they were weak, because they had forgotten the teachings of Confucius, a Chinese philosopher. And the solution for him was to bring in a new idea from Europe called democracy. And that would actually enhance Confucian methods of self-improvement in Vietnam. And that's kind of an odd argument to make because political theorists tend to agree with each other that democracy and liberalism are opposed to Confucianism. But Pham Chu-Chin says actually liberalism and Confucianism are perfectly compatible. And I argue that's because he kind of misreads liberalism, but in a creative way. And it kind of shows us that it's okay to see foreign ideas as foreign and to romanticize them and maybe misinterpret them even for your own purposes to revive a faltering tradition.
That's super interesting. So just going chronologically, the second set of writers follow. They're like the second generation of these thinkers. How do they interact with that first generation, and what do they think should be done with tradition, which is established by that first generation?
Right. So Pham Boi Cho and Pham Chu-Chin wrote primarily in Chinese, classical Chinese. They could not really read French, but Nguyen An Ninh and Pham Quynh, they're like 2 decades younger. They were educated in the top French language schools. They were very familiar with European ideas. And so Nguyen An Ninh argued that the Vietnamese should stop depending on Confucian ideas and instead turn to Indian and German great thinkers as role models in order to create a new, authentic Vietnamese intellectual culture. But Pham Quynh personally attacked Nguyen An Ninh in newspapers for having the wrong ideas. So Quynh uses his journal, Nam Phong, which, by the way, is the name of our podcast, Nam Phong meaning the southern wind, to assert the value of Confucianism and Vietnamese national language and culture. So he wants to harmonize Eastern and Western ideas to create a new Vietnamese national identity.
So coming from Vietnam, addressing the last two thinkers, the first one is very controversial. To write about Ho Chi Minh is very controversial. So I want to hear about that in a second. And then also coming from Vietnam, the second one, you never hear him at all because he is someone who is sidelined, marginalized by the Communist Party. So how do you engage with these two in your book?
Right. Very controversial figure. And by that, I'll tell you a very brief story. I was a teenager, I was around 16, and I was with my parents at these Vietnamese, in California. It's New Year's is happening, and then I say to him, who is Ho Chi Minh, and why do people hate him? And so my dad said, well, he was a terrible person, and he didn't want to talk about it. That night, when we came home, I immediately go up to my room, I Google Ho Chi Minh, I start reading his writings, and I didn't find anything wrong with those writings. I thought it sounded quite patriotic. So I came home, I walked downstairs, my dad was watching TV, and I said, Dad, I read Ho Chi Minh, and he seems like a good guy. And then I just ran back upstairs. I didn't let him respond. Dinner time comes around, and I go downstairs, and he stops cooking, and he walks up to me, and he puts his finger in my face, and he goes, don't you ever say Ho Chi Minh was a good guy. It turns out that many Vietnamese in the diaspora, especially those traumatized from the refugee experiences, see Ho Chi Minh as a representative of, all the suffering that they had undergone. In my book, I do not say he was a good guy or a bad guy. Today, he's seen as a hero in Vietnam. There's a mausoleum, but I don't say he's a good guy or a bad guy. What I do instead is I explain how he understood himself and his world, and I argue that he sees himself as a critic of dehumanization and an architect of rehumanization. He explains to the Vietnamese that the racial dehumanization that they face is a consequence of capitalism and colonialism, and he has a vision for how the Vietnamese can restore their dignity, and I call this vision paternalistic democracy. That's his political theory. What do I mean by it? Read my book and find out.
I also meant controversial in the sense that because he is such a, at least in Vietnam, someone who's very constructed and worshipped, we don't write about him. We don't tamper with that image at all. And so it's very interesting to see a deep dive into some of his political thought in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, and you had asked about the last thinker.
Yes.
So I actually learned of Nguyen Minh Tuong because of you, Yen. That's how we met. So I was in the audience when Yen was giving a presentation about Nguyen Minh Tuong in Paris, and I was really excited because her presentation was on how Nguyen Minh Tuong read Michel de Montaigne, my favorite philosopher. So the last figure had a very different vision of national dignity than Ho Chi Minh. In the mid-1950s, Nguyen Minh Tuong was banished from society by the Communist Party. The Vietnamese had just won their independence, and now he was criticizing the Vietnamese revolutionary leaders for becoming dogmatic and authoritarian. And he says that he's criticizing communists, not communism. So he turns to the 16th century French essayist Michel de Montaigne, and through Montaigne, Nguyen Minh Tuong argued that national dignity required defending and celebrating individual freedom of thought and speech.
So now that we've gone through some of the table contents and what you say about these thinkers, let's dive into your main argument, which is about national shame, which is, to me, the flip side, the other side of dignity, which you had mentioned earlier. So can you tell us about how shame can be this motivating, mobilizing factor?
Yeah. For these thinkers, national shame was kind of the engine that would take them on this road to dignity. So despite their differences, they all had one thing in common. And I really didn't expect this going into this project, but as I read, one thing I noticed was that they were constantly shaming their own people into action. For example, Phan Boi Cho says to his countrymen, "Those whom I blame most deeply are my people themselves." Phan Chu Trinh laments, "It's a shame that our people cannot look after their basic personal needs and prepare for their old age, let alone think of society or humanity. How could we not respect the Europeans if they're so superior to us?" Nguyen Anh Ninh says, "If we take stock of the purely literary and artistic achievements that have been produced here, the intellectual legacy of our ancestors would certainly be meager alongside the heritages of other people. Today, when India and Japan are producing thinkers and artists whose talent and genius shine forth as brightly as those of Europe, Vietnam is but an infant that does not yet even have the notion or power to grope toward a better destiny and genuine deliverance." So I just want to pause here real quick and say, because of Chinese domination for 1,000 years, it was difficult, according to these thinkers, to identify an indigenous intellectual tradition to be proud of. I think if you took a time machine and went to China or India in the 1920s, you would not get this problem. They were quite proud of having their own. But one interesting thing about Vietnam is it sheds light on how people living in the peripheries, might feel. Pham Quynh scolds the youth. The youth lack personal power, strength, temper of character, that vigor of spirit, and that moral virility. Ho Chi Minh declared in a letter, "Instead of blaming ourselves or others, I think it's more reasonable to blame ourselves. We must ask ourselves, for what reasons have the French been able to oppress us? Why are our people so stupid? Why hasn't our revolution succeeded?" And after the French were finally expelled in 1954, Nguyen Minh Tuong shamed revolutionary leaders for having alienated their individuality and even their personality, replacing it with the double of themselves, whose reactions are remote controlled from the outside. So, many scholars have talked about how shame is destructive. And of course, it can be destructive. But these thinkers were trying to use it productively. They knew it wouldn't be enough to say, look, the French are exploiting us and abusing us. So that might be enough to spark anger, but it wasn't enough to get the Vietnamese to devote themselves to the daily, long-term project of changing their society, their habits, their values, their culture for revolution. For them, shame could be an emotional engine to goad their people into productive action. Kind of like a parent, like, shame on you. I know you're smart and capable, but you're being lazy. You can and you must rise to the occasion. I mean, that's the kind of attitude that I get from these writings.
I feel like unless you are a child of immigrants and have never had that experience of a parent breathing down your neck, shaming you, this is like really counterintuitive. Usually one would say that it's national pride that actually gets people feeling good and mobilized toward action. And so that's kind of like self-respect is for the individual. So how do you respond to this?
So this is another scholarly theoretical intervention. Scholars have so far assumed that national identity requires or comes from pride, and that national shame comes from doing bad things to others. So for Americans, national shame is maybe slavery or genocide of Native Americans. For Germans, national shame is the Holocaust, etc. But for these Vietnamese thinkers, national shame is a sense of inadequacy, political, moral, intellectual. And for typically, national responsibility is the righting of the wrongs that of those bad actions. And this is because scholars typically have in mind dominating, colonizing nations when they talk about national identity. But from these thinkers, we gain a new perspective on national shame. Again, for them, national shame rather than pride can be a source of national identity, and shame can come from a sense of inadequacy. And their national responsibility is to assert themselves to remake the nation. So while traditional understandings of national identity make more sense to explain how national identity can be sustained over time through pride of a nation's achievements, these Vietnamese thinkers can help us see how national identity is created from scratch.
So I'm hearing too that national shame is instead of something bad that you've done, it's the feeling of lacking or inferiority.
Right, yeah.
So in my opening remarks, I gestured toward this idea of an age of enlightenment. And what I'm seeing too in your book is multiple occasions where a lot of these thinkers are revisiting some of the material that they've heard or read or learned about, but in a new lens. And they are adopting this new attitude. So can you talk a little bit more about what that new attitude entails, like this age of enlightenment?
Yeah. So we have to remember that Vietnam was a deeply Confucian culture and country because of the Chinese influence. And one thing around the turn of the century, from the 19th century to the 20th century, is that they looked again at their Confucian traditions, and especially at this idea of self-cultivation. For Confucius, the most worthwhile thing you could do with your time is improve your moral character and to learn. So when we think of the European Enlightenment, we think of a new emphasis on reason and relying on critical thinking rather than on tradition. But in 1907, there was a Vietnamese Enlightenment. So after Phan Boi Cho and Phan Chu Trinh returned from Japan, where they were studying and being inspired by the Japanese, they helped inspire the creation of a school called the Tonkin Free School. And the manifesto of this school blamed conservative elites for weakening Vietnam, thereby preventing it from progress and making it vulnerable to foreign conquest. And they called for the Vietnamese to dignify themselves through their own efforts by breaking free from constraining tradition. But they harness Confucianism in a different way. So they emphasize rationality as a means to progress. So in short, the manifesto called for a Vietnamese Enlightenment. It said that they need to promote competition, because competition requires and rewards open-mindedness, and competition requires critical thinking and the use of reason, and more competition generates more thinking, and more thinking requires a mind that's open to new ideas with which to have conceptual tools to think. So in fact, Fulbright University, where you teach, recently had a conference about the Tonkin Free School, saying that Fulbright is continuing a tradition of liberal arts education in Vietnam. So I went to Fulbright for that conference, and I've met your students. So I actually want to ask you a question now. I'm really curious, I'm an American, a Vietnamese American, how do you think they would receive my book in Vietnam, young people?
It's actually, now that you're talking about the Tonkin Free School, is making me realize that maybe saying Fulbright is the first liberal arts institution is not correct, and that we should try draw that connection to the Tonkin Free School being that first institution. But Fulbright really prides itself with creating this unprecedented space for intellectual engagement, and we really push the boundaries. We read a lot of banned texts. and the Ministry of Education is very much aware of our curriculum. I'm not sure how we're able to do this, but I'm not going to ask any questions. But because we cultivate that space and students enter our classrooms having this mindset, I think they would really open to your book, especially because it gives them these new perspectives into figures that they're very familiar with. They're very familiar with Phan Bội Châu, Phan Chu Trinh, who are these national heroes, as well as Ho Chi Minh, and not so much Nguyễn Mạnh Tường, but I think they would be really interested in hearing about Ho Chi Minh's political thought and not just him as a national president. And Nguyễn Mạnh Tường, because Nguyễn Mạnh Tường is someone who is not talked about because of his criticisms of the Communist Party in the 1950s. So I think they would really welcome that, and I like to think that it's because of this cultivated space that we have made for unprecedented intellectual engagement. Yeah. So any last words about your book to the audience before we ask questions, or we open up the floor to questions?
I guess. So the novelist Toni Morrison once said, if there's a book that you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. So this was me for this book. I imagined the reader as myself when I was 18. So it's accessible, it's easy to read. I try to make it fun. And I guess I would perhaps encourage the young scholars here, I see some of my students, thank you for coming, to do the same. If you want to read a book that hasn't been written yet, you must write it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. 20 minutes.
So now we welcome questions.
We have about 20 minutes, and if you raise your hand, I will field the questions. Yeah, so yes, gentlemen over here.
And we have a microphone too.
Yeah, but we have also a live stream.
Thank you. I thank you. It was really very interesting. I was wondering, in you more or less counterpose the Western tradition, identifying it with the individual, and the Vietnamese tradition, identifying with the nation, rights versus duties, and so on. But in the West, you also have a tradition of nationalism and duty. So I wonder if you could, let's compare Vietnamese thinkers with people like Mazzini or Mickiewicz. So nationalists who very much emphasize duty. What happens to your book then?
I love this question because one of Phan Bội Châu favorite thinkers is Mazzini. And so what I mean by the West focusing on the individual is this kind of liberal, classical liberal tradition in the West. But what I really mean for Vietnam is this Confucian way of looking at the world, where you really see society as a family society. And nationalism did not exist in the early 20th century. That's precisely why Phan Bội Châu and Phan Chu Trinh were trying to make the Vietnamese nationalists. They had no sense of being part of a nation. At the Tonkin Free School, it was the first time people from the village could look at a map of a drawing of Vietnam and see how it looked. So they were trying to generate nationalism, and they turned to Mazzini, and they were saying, we need to have nationalism just like the Europeans do.
Around the corner, there's a question.
Yeah, okay.
Hi, Kevin. Congratulations on the book. You gave me a lot to think about in terms of the idea of national shame and the sentiments of it, because it's something that is continuing in Vietnam in a lot of ways. But my question revolves a little bit more around, so when these thinkers, when you were doing research about these thinkers, what do they say about what is Vietnamese to them, right? Because when you think about Vietnam, it's different populations, north to south, middle, they're all different, right? So is the dignity that they are crafting, how is that, what's their vision of allocation of that dignities, and how are people responding to it?
That's a great question. For Ho Chi Minh, for example, it was very clear he was giving directions to party cadres. this is what party leaders must do in order to guide the masses to his vision of socialism. Keep in mind, all these thinkers were elites. They were well-educated elites. And for example, some like Pham was quite conservative and elitist, and he said, we need to bring in the best ideas from the West. How do we know what's the best? Well, people like me need to read the material first and then see what is consumable for the masses. We need to guide the masses. So they were elitists. So they saw themselves that way, and they wanted to guide their people. But in an objective sense, I mean, they had many followers. Phan Chu Trinh funeral was the first national funeral. Hundreds of thousands, people say, came out. Same with Nguyen An Ninh when he was arrested several times by the French. Thousands and thousands of students would go out and protest. So I guess to answer your question, it's for everyone, kind of. They leave it quite vague, actually. Yeah.
If I may,
go ahead.
As a literary scholar, this is where what being Vietnamese is really grounded in. It's in the language. So for Pham Nguyen especially, the Vietnamese language is the essence of being Vietnamese. And this is especially important because this is a period where languages are transitioning. We have literary Chinese that's used but not very accessible. We have a demotic gnome that is also used but not accessible because it's also characters. And then we have French that's coming in and kind of challenging those languages. And so the Vietnamese were like, there's all of these languages that are being used. Which one should we use that will be sustainable? And so it's the creation and usage of a Romanized Vietnamese script. And Pham Nguyen has a famous line where he says, he refers to a classic Vietnamese text called Truyện Kiều. And he says, if Truyện Kiều exists, that means our language exists. And if our language exists, then Vietnam exists.
Yeah. And just to add to this, so Truyện Kiều is the tale of Kiều. And it was originally a Chinese novel that a Vietnamese person basically rewrote, but in a better way. So Pham Nguyen says, the original China is kind of boring, but this is perfect. It's beautiful. That's what makes the Vietnamese so amazing. All of these thinkers were promoting the option of Quốc ngữ, which is Vietnamese in Roman characters. They would say, we need to get our people literate as soon as possible. It's easier to learn the Roman alphabet than the Chinese characters. But they really did have these options of French or Vietnamese or Chinese.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, thank you and congratulations for the launch of your new books. I am from the hometown of Ho Chi Minh and Phan Bội Châu, and my high school was named after Phan Bội Châu as well. And I have a question also. Somewhere in the middle, you asked about how the Vietnamese, young Vietnamese now thinking of your book. And I reading some chapter of your book, and I feel reflective and at the same time empowering. And I have a question that what do you think about how national shaming is operating in Vietnam nowadays, given that the course like Ho Chi Minh ideology is now teaching in university? Yeah. Thank you.
That's a really great question, and thank you for the comment. It means a lot to me, really. National shame was especially apparent in the 1920s. Now, after that, 1940s onward, there was a lot more pride, a lot more optimism. And if you go to Vietnam today, there's kind of I was reading this story, this American was in a taxi cab, and the taxi driver, the Vietnamese, said, we have defeated, the Chinese, the French, the Americans. We're full of pride, And so the short answer is I don't know, because I travel to Vietnam quite often, every year, and I don't really see much shame. I see pride, actually. How would you answer that?
Well, I would say that I didn't see any national, because I grew up with, the idea of 4,000 years of history, so 4,000 năm lịch sử, something like that. But there's more like individual shaming rather than national shame. Yeah, but yeah.
One thing I should mention, though, is that we are seeing some national shame in the work of writers reflecting on the Civil War. how shameful Vietnamese people were killing Vietnamese people with foreign weapons and foreign ideas. How shameful. So I have been seeing some of that. Yeah.
And in my observation living in Vietnam for the past almost 3 years, I wouldn't say national shaming is happening anymore, but there is a shaming about the economic development. And so there's a lot of attention that is being paid to trying to grow very, very fast to mitigate the fact that things are moving very fast. You know, Taiwan, Korea, all these East Asian countries, how do we catch up to that?
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Philippe Pham. I wrote about this period, so I'm very happy to see your book, Kevin. Congratulations. Just want to, in this discussion on the idea of shame, when you refer to the 1920s, what I remember in reading the Vietnamese newspapers, the generational gap, because. And I was talking on the train to Mehan about that, because I remember that the older generation, the Chinese, some kind of still educated generation, they were very much into some kind of moralistic, actually super boring, frustrating discourse language about shaming people in a very, it was, to me, it became almost very frustrating to read, because it was always sanctimonious, that's the word. And I compared to the generation of people like Nguyen Ninh, for instance, I think it's a different shame. With Nguyen Ninh, it's a positive shame. It's based on the capacity of the individual to achieve things, and he's upset by the fact that too few people of his generation are unable to, or capable of waking up to their own capacity to engage. So I think that's where, to me, I would see a qualitative difference. So maybe related to Confucianism and so on. And one point also, when you mentioned that between Don King and Fulbright, there's almost nothing. Well, there were many private schools by many of those intellectuals, especially in the South, including by Dong Yu, for instance, the poet, that were really avant-garde, that will be still totally subversive in today's Vietnam. So, you know, there are many stories of private schools that really developed some quite interesting imaginaries in education.
Philip Pham wrote a fantastic book, The Birth of Political Journalism.
The Birth of Political Journalism.
It is, yeah,
I was like, wow, that's Philip?
But I remember being a graduate student in California, waiting for my laundry to finish at the laundromat, reading your book and getting ideas for this book. So it's very great that he's here. Absolutely. The only thing I have to add is Nguyen Ninh arguably was inspired by Nietzsche, you know, rise to the occasion, push yourself. And Pham Nguyen would criticize Nguyen Ninh for this. Pham Nguyen would say, Nguyen Ninh had no idea who he was, and he's claiming to lead a whole generation of people. Nguyen Ninh had an identity crisis, and he became a Buddhist monk. He shaved his head, and he's just lost, and now he's trying to lead a whole generation, what, off a cliff? You know, so the debates there are interesting. I see a few. Can we take one from Lynn? Yeah? Or?
Hi, Kevin. I'm so happy to be here today, and also just congratulations to the book. Your course was really my favorite of previous year, my last year of bachelor. So yeah, for that, further congratulations. But I also have a very, I think, enduring question that I've always had when I think about Vietnamese nationalism, and that is, who are the people? And I just have to think about, you know, all the ethnic minorities in Vietnam. Like, there are 54 of them. And so all these thinkers, they wonder, how can we fight for freedom and how can we preserve it? But my question is, how do we also make it available for other Vietnamese? And because, like, also a lot of times when you ask, I don't know, to any foreign person who is not Vietnamese, like, yeah, what do you think of when you think of Vietnamese people? They will only think about the king people, like us, but they will not think about, you know, other brothers and sisters. So that's also, yeah, the question I've always had.
Thank you for that question, Lynn. You were one of my favorite students. One thing that I failed to mention in my presentation is that some of these Vietnamese thinkers were proud of the fact that the Vietnamese were colonizers. When the French were colonizing them, Pham would say, we used to be great colonizers, conquering the Pham and the Khmer peoples as we moved from the north down to the south, justifying it by saying we belong to a superior Han civilization. So you're right. I mean, it's also a colonial project. I mean, it's a settler colonial state. But when the question of the people is a really important one, I just happened to be working on a new project about so-called re-education camps after the war. So my grandfather on my dad's side and my grandfather on my mom's side were imprisoned in re-education camps after the Vietnam War. And I was looking into some of the scholarly writings about this. How did the Vietnamese government justify these camps? And the main thing that they were saying is that the camps are a form of clemency, of showing mercy, of inviting those who had left the nation to come back into the nation, to become part of the people. I think it's a very interesting perspective, you know, but of course my dad gets angry. He says, don't call them re-education camps. They were forced labor concentration camps. There's a lot of torture going on. These are flawed human beings taking out revenge, not like purely virtuous Marxists, you know. So it's a very complex history there, but it really much involves your question of who are the people and what are the boundaries of this nation. Going to Vietnam, there's a museum about the ethnic people, and so you're right, there is a kind of kin superiority in Vietnam, and so I would be interested to see how they are having their kinds of conversations about their past, like Americans are, like the Dutch are. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Over there.
In the middle, yeah.
Hi. Thank you for your words, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. You mentioned female thinkers quickly in Vietnam, and I was wondering, when researching, did you find any interesting female thinkers? Are they actually being studied right now, and is there any documentation on them?
Thanks for the question. So after I finished writing this book, I felt guilty for focusing only on men. So I researched into, you know, who were women thinkers. There's a really fascinating woman, Nguyen Thi Dinh. She was a military commander. She rose to the height. She wrote a memoir called No Other Road to Take. And I published an article, if you're interested. It's called, I forgot the name of my own research. Oh my gosh, it's about the Maquis. It's about
With the Saigon sisters?
with the Saigon sisters. So okay, it'll come to me. I guess I'm nervous. So there's another great book called Saigon Sisters, and it's a collection of oral history narratives of Vietnamese women, educated women in Saigon, who in the 1950s, sacrificed their privileged lives to go into the jungle, to go into the Maquis. And so there's a great discussion of what it was like, also gender-wise. There are several books of even the women must fight, but there's really not that much on gender in Vietnam. But I would recommend those. Yeah.
And there are a number of women who played really important roles connecting people, especially through journals. And I guess maybe Philip could talk about this a little bit more, because there was a number of Southern Vietnamese women who had very powerful positions connecting people with money. And so I think in examining women, you would have to examine different questions of manipulating or playing with the power, almost like behind the scenes in their own ways.
Right. And I mean, the topic of gender was a really important issue in the 1920s, this changing society. What is the proper role of men and women? And how do women negotiate these traditional expectations at the same time they want to be revolutionaries, you know? And so, yeah, these are important issues. So. In the back there.
Hello, so congratulations on your newly published book. And so I also have a question about the notion of national shame, because like when you talk about that, it kind of invoke some memories of me when I was in high school, and then like I studied like two poems of two generals from the Trần dynasty, like 13th to 14th century in Vietnam, and they also had show the how they feel shamed for not being able to protect the country or to have some achievement and accomplishment in in protecting and developing the country. So I believe that like that sentiment, the national shame must have some roots, even like before the colonizing era in Vietnam. So how can we locate it in terms of genealogy and history?
Yeah.
Yes, that's my question.
That's a great question. I don't, my language skills, because I'm in Chinese, right? That like those are the texts. So, yeah. So that's a fascinating question, but I just don't know that much about that history. But there is somebody here who does some work on that Ran Thai. Yeah. So anyway, so should we take one more? And then I do want people to have time to have some delicious snacks. So maybe we could take one more. Yeah.
Yes. Hello, Ms. Kevin. First, I want to congratulations you on producing your book. And my second question is, Vietnamese people in the colonization, we always have revolutions. We always have national shaming on each individual's thinkings. So what's the differences do these thinkers have done on people, and how do they motivate the people with their words? And can you spot the differences between the thinkers here? Like the differences between them, because there are 6 people that you mentioned, but only one succeeds, and 5 of them are memorized worships, but not success, right? Yes.
I love this. Okay, this is a great end, because actually, if you look at how, I think we're seeing a revival of Nguyen Minh Tuong. He had an interview on Facebook, and I saw thousands of Vietnamese people saying, we need to bring Nguyen Minh Tuong back. And there's a new Phan Chu Trinh, interest in Phan Chu Trinh. There's new interest in Nguyen An Ninh, too. So in their own ways, I think we're seeing a comeback, actually, in Vietnam. Pham Quynh, I was surprised to see brand new published, edited volumes of his work in Hanoi. So I think, yeah, Ho Chi Minh's ideas did win, but I think we're actually seeing a revival of these thinkers today. Perhaps. So
I'm thinking about that. So if you enjoyed this conversation, Kevin and I do have a podcast, and we encourage you to listen to that. We talk about all sorts of things, personal topics as well as academic ones. We review books, and so that's available on Spotify as well as other platforms where you get your podcasts. I do have some logistical information to announce. It is time to mingle. You can buy books in this left-hand corner here for the price of 25 euros, and we take tiki as well as cash. You can also buy Nam Pham merchandise. You can get a mug or a tote, or the stickers are free. Those do not cost any money. There is food from Bonjour Cafe, and as well as drinks. And I will announce that we do need to be out by 10.
There's flexibility, though.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much for coming, and we hope you had a good time.